What's going on, everybody? This is the Tom Rowland Podcast, brought to you by Brite. Brite is the maker of some of the finest cleaning products out there. Keep your boat shiny and awesome. Today, we have what I consider an unexpected gem in a conversation with someone that I have been communicating with over the text line. I do respond to the text line. If you're interested in talking to me, it's 305-930-7346. That is where I met Carter Smith-Wellman. Carter Smith-Wellman is a guide in Saint Croix, fishes out of kayaks in Saint Croix. He's the only inshore guide on Saint Croix. Not only that, but he is fishing bonefish in a slightly different way than maybe anyone listening to this fishes for them regularly. We all have a story of catching a bonefish on a pilchard or a jig or something where we were kind of not expecting to catch a nice bonefish, and we catch one on something that didn't seem like a bonefish bait. But he's doing that regularly. He's catching them with rapalas, with swim baits, diving baits, and he is targeting bonefish with those lures and doing it very, very effectively. He goes over the history of Saint Croix, tells us quite a lot about his fishery there. I really thought this was one of the most interesting podcasts that we've done in quite some time, so I encourage you to listen. Here is Carter Smith-Wellman from Saint Croix. Here we go.
I'm Carter Smith-Wellman, and this is the Tom Rowland Podcast.
Carter, what's up? How are you, man?
I'm good, Tom. Thanks for having me on today.
I appreciate it. I'm glad to have you on. I want to know about your fishery. Tell me where you are.
So right now I'm based out of Saint Croix in the U.S. Virgin Islands. So for those of the folks that might be listening and that haven't heard of that, we're a small island, part of the U.S. Virgin Islands, just south of Puerto Rico, about 40 miles. Kind of isolated. We've got St. Thomas, St. John, and the BVIs to our north, and then we've got Puerto Rico, Culebra to our east.
St. Croix. And is there a national park there?
Yes, we've got a few national parks. Buck Island's the most famous one. It's a national park that the Rockefellers set up back in the 50s. And then we've also got Sandy Point National Wildlife Refuge, which is one of the largest nesting laying beaches in the Caribbean as well.
Very cool. Very cool. I haven't been to St. Croix. I've been to the U.S. and the British Virgin Islands, but never St. Croix. And that's definitely on the list. I need to go there for sure. I need to come down there and fish with you is what I need to do. Tell me about
anytime.
your fishing, man. Tell me, like, you're catching a lot of bonefish. I see that on Instagram, but I also think they're permit there, right? There's pretty good permit fishing.
Yep. Yeah, so we've got every slam species here. And in fact, in the last year, we've actually landed over 32 unique species.
Oh, really?
So being in the Caribbean, being in this tropical climate, we have quite the diversity in our fishery here. Everything from snappers and jacks to, barracuda, boxfish, triggerfish, snook, permit, tarpon, and of course the bonefish as well.
What about the parrotfish? Are you fishing for those at all?
So that's a great question. I've only actually seen one instance of the parrotfish up on the flats tailing. So for the most part, those parrotfish tend to stick more to the deeper coral reefs. So we don't typically target them too much. They're actually a popular fish to eat down here. A lot of the commercial guys down here will get them in fish cages. And so we call them pot fish, basically just any sort of fish that you catch in a pot and you cook in a pot. But as far as recreationally going, not too common for parrotfish to be seen kind of on our flats.
What about triggers?
So triggers are around, but again, they typically also like a little bit of that deeper water. So you could potentially go for them, but we've just got so many other species here that at some point you kind of have to pick a lane and really become an expert at what you want. And so for us, and for me personally, it's the slam species that I really try to focus on and really try to kind of get my clients on those species specifically.
And so as far as the tarpon goes, tell me about the way that you fish for tarpon or where you find them. What type of areas are you able to find them in?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got two different ways that we can fish for tarpon. One of them is on the flats. And so our flats here, you're probably pretty familiar with this in the Caribbean. A lot of grass, and then we have these big sinkholes, kind of potholes we call them, where it's a depression in the flat, and you're going to have anywhere from 6 to maybe 3 foot of additional depth. And a lot of time, what we see happen here is the bait gets brought up on the flat, and the birds are diving on it in the skinny water, and that pushes them into these deeper pockets. And that's typically when we see those tarpon and those snooks show up on the flats to feed on them. But what's really cool down here is in June, we had our first huge patch of sargassum come onto the South Shore here. And so that sargassum, if you're a tourist, that's your worst enemy because that could ruin your vacation. But if you're an angler, that's probably the most exciting thing you can see or smell is a bunch of sargassum, because what that does is St. Croix is an extremely isolated fishery. And so we don't have a lot of new nutrients that come to the island. The island is very self-sustaining. But with the sargassum mats, it brings in those sargasso crabs. It's been bringing in anchovies. And so we've been having a lot of tarpon, bonefish, and snook feeding on those sargassum lines. So we've probably hooked 2,000-3,000 pounds of tarpon just off of this one beach over the last 30 days.
Wow.
It's been some of the best tarpon fishing I've ever seen.
That's really
400 or
cool.
500 individuals just on a little 2,000 strip foot of beach.
So did those tarpon come in somehow from the deeper water and now they're available to you because they follow in the seaweed, or were they there all the time and they're just concentrated now? Like, what do you think is going on there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So basically, this island has 14,000 foot drops on the north and the west sides, as well as the south side. So there's not very many inshore fish that are going to traverse the second deepest trench in the Caribbean Sea. So for the vast majority of our fish, including tarpon, they are going to be here 24/7, 365. The key is where are they, not if they're here.
Right.
And so what happens is when you get those big sargassum mats that come in and you get 1 million bait fish in a bay, you'll probably get tarpon 2, 3, 4 bays down, making that journey to find that. And so, in a month from now, I could go fish this spot and there won't be a single tarpon.
Really?
But when they show up typically anywhere from 50 to 500 individuals at a time.
Wow, that's so awesome. And what we have in the Keys, we have something that we refer to as a shrimp hatch. And when our sargassum piles up, then, the shrimp hatch really will be shrimp coming out of the mangroves, but it happens a lot around these sargassum patches and these areas that kind of smell sulfury, like you're talking about. And the shrimp kind of comes out, and I think that the water has kind of low oxygen because of the decaying mats and everything. And so it's usually on an outgoing tide when the water has the least amount of oxygen. And these shrimp are kind of like just swimming slow and kind of up on the surface, kind of, and fish too will be doing this. And the tarpon get in there, and because they can roll in the low oxygenated water, they're rolling often. So it's easy for us to see them and find them and know where they are. But then they can just go in there and clean house on these bait fish and shrimp that are not, at their full capacity because the oxygen level's low. Are you seeing things like that going on there, or are they just kind of eating everything that's in the sargassum?
Yeah, that's a great point. We are absolutely seeing that. And that's one of the reasons why fishing sargassum is so great for tarpon is, as you pointed out, the more that sargassum starts to break down, the more it starts to eat up that oxygen. And so when we're going on fishing these sargassum mats, you're seeing them tailing all the time. I mean, it is a sight fishing dream. And the beauty of it is you can wade out into about probably 3 foot of water. So you're about, waist deep, maybe a little bit, just under the chest. And what I like to do is get out to about 2-3 feet from the edge of that sargassum line. And what you'll see is tarpon rolling right on the edge. I mean, we're talking within a fly rod distance of where you're standing. And that is absolutely what we're seeing. Now, what's interesting is we went out on Monday. And we had some pretty strong winds. We had 20, 30 mile an hour winds, and the seas were white capping in the bay. And we didn't see one tarpon roll. Now, we hooked up a few. We caught a couple big ones. Seemed like the 50, 60 pounders were out there that day. But that was really interesting because for the first 3-4 weeks, you'd go over there and it would just be hundreds of tails. Absolutely incredible. And then when the seas picked up and that white water started to oxygenate the seas, we still had thick sargassum mats, but we didn't see more than 2-3 tails, despite hooking in a 5-6 tarpon on the fly in just a couple hours. So that's definitely an advantage of fishing sargassum, is that you typically will see those tarpon having to roll a lot more because of that low oxygen level.
Yeah, it's so cool. I mean, we have a tremendous amount of that, and sometimes it's too much, and sometimes the offshore fishermen, like it when it piles up into mats, and don't like it when it's all scattered because it's all over your baits that you're trying to troll or everything. So, I mean, sargassum can be such a beautiful thing under the right circumstance. And then, like when we're tarpon fishing at the bridge or whatever, the tide's just running through there. It's just constantly getting on the baits or the mullet or the live baits that you're fishing with. So constantly reeling it in, getting it off. But when it's there and it's the right circumstance, it is a fish magnet, and that's so cool that you're doing that. So how do you end up in Saint Croix, or were you born there?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So my mother was born here, and her mother came down here in the 50s and met my grandfather here. And so I was born in Connecticut. My mom ended up going to college up in Connecticut, where she met my father. And so I was born up there, but we would go down to the Caribbean every year, once or twice, to see the grandparents. So I was coming here since 3 weeks old. And so that's really what got me onto St. Croix initially. And then during COVID, I was working in the energy and sustainability space, and everything went remote. So I ended up kind of coming down here for a year and working remote. And I just realized that I was waking up most days not to go to work, but to get off work so I could go out and go fishing. And one day I just had a light bulb moment. I was like, that's not what you want to do with your life. You don't want to just wake up and sit behind the computer for 8-9 hours a day. So that's when I decided to make a switch. And about 16 months ago, I left my, the consulting career and started the inshore fishing company that I run today.
And what it's mostly, are you catering mostly to tourists, or is there a destination angling kind of community that's already coming there that you can tap into, or what's your clientele?
Yeah, I would say it's probably 80% tourists. We do get some guys that have fished all around the world, really good anglers. We've been getting a lot more fly fishing clients. That's something that I didn't expect when I started this up. I was thinking we're going to be doing mostly spin, but we're getting a lot more fly fishing clients. But I would not say that St. Croix is on the radar. In fact, I would say it's really under the radar. And you can just tell because I'm the only inshore fishing guide out here.
Oh, that's so cool.
So, and there's only ever been one.
Really?
Yep, there's really only ever been one company for the last 15 years that has been doing inshore, and they shut down basically Christmas of 2022, and that's what really light bulb kind of went off, and realized that there were only deep sea charters here, and so wanted to kind of figure out a way to reinvent the fishery a little bit. So actually we run almost all of our charters off of kayaks, off of Hobies, which is pretty cool. And in part, it's because a lot of our best flats and fisheries are pretty close to our launch points. You can't get there from the road because it's private property, but the beautiful thing down here is every beach is public access. So as long as you get to the beach from the waterfront, you can unlock a lot of this island that you traditionally couldn't unlock without some sort of vessel to get you there.
Wow. That's awesome, man. Well, anytime that you're a pioneer in an area or the only one, dude, that's amazing. That's so cool that you're doing that. So what was St. Croix like in COVID? Was it locked down or like what was the scene?
It was definitely locked down for a while. One of the things in the Caribbean is healthcare is a huge issue here. Not very, we might be part of the United States, but we definitely don't have mainland access to healthcare. So, we might have 5 or 6 beds in an ICU here. So the island was very cautious about COVID, because if we did get a big outbreak, they would not have been able to handle it. And, you would have seen some pretty devastating results. So they locked it down. But the cool thing, and I think this is actually something that's been huge for the U.S. Virgin Islands, and you see it even today, is when the whole world locked down, a lot of people still wanted to go somewhere tropical, get away, have a vacation, kind of forget about, the craziness that's happening. And the U.S. Virgin Islands saw a huge increase in tourism. And they had a little portal, you had to give them a negative COVID test, but, there's no passport requirement to get here. If you're a U.S. citizen, you can come here just like you would go any other state, or like Puerto Rico is the same way. So, you had a lot of folks that did come to this island for the very first time during COVID. And it definitely started to see a bit of an uptick. But one thing that was in the fishing community specifically is when it did start out, they started enforcing curfews.
Oh.
And curfews for the commercial guys are really difficult, because a lot of those guys like to go out 3, 4 a.m. And so their days were a little bit, basically they couldn't fish the way they normally could. And so there was probably about 6 months right at the beginning of COVID when, we didn't really understand what was happening, how bad it could be. So the island really was locked down, like a lot of cities, like a lot of states did. And so I actually think that lockdown was a huge kind of reprieve for the inshore fishery, especially the bait fish. And I think that little 3-4 month window where they didn't get pressured at all, really gave them a chance to catch their breath and, get a really strong spawn. So our spawn typically happens in April. And so that kind of aligns almost perfectly with when COVID started in that February, March, April timeframe. And so, that first 60 days of lockdown, typically, in April, you're really trying to get as many sprat as you can, because you're getting the real big ones in there. So a lot of the commercial guys are catching thousands of sprat in these massive spawning schools. And so they couldn't do that. And so that, I think, was a part of the reason why this year the fishing has been absolutely lights out, better than I've ever seen it in the 10 plus years I've been fishing down here.
Wow. That's awesome. So you referred to the bait fish as sprat? What bait fish is that? I mean, I'm sure it's a bait fish that we have, but we call it something else probably.
Yeah, so that was one of the things I had to figure out. So if you Google sprat, it turns out it's a freshwater bait fish out of the Netherlands.
Uh-huh.
And it actually makes a lot of sense, because the West Indies, or the Dutch West Indies, basically you had a bunch of guys coming over here back in the 16, 17, 1800s, and they would see these minnow-like creatures in the salt. And so they would call them sprat, because it reminded them of the fish back in Europe. And so in the West Indies and in the Caribbean in general, almost everybody locally is going to refer to the bait fish as sprat. But the issue is there's about 6 or 7 different varieties of bait fish that are deemed sprat. Mm-hmm. But what we were able to find is the number one most consistent bait fish is something that I'm sure you're very familiar with, the pilchard.
Yes, sir. That's our bread and butter right there in the Florida Keys, the pilchard and the mullet, for the most part, but the pilchard, that's what we have. So you have a good population of pilchards.
Yes, we've got a very healthy pilchard population. And in fact, I would say that is, especially on a biomass perspective, probably 70 to 80% of the bait biomass is going to be pilchards.
Wow. And then what are these other 6 or 7 bait fish that you have?
Yeah, so you're going to have a few different types of sardines. You're going to have a couple of herrings. And then we get anchovies. Right now, we got a bunch of anchovies that come in with the sargassum. And glass minnows are the other ones. So really, pilchards, anchovies, and glass minnows, those are like the big 3. But you've got a couple other types of herring out there, very similar to a pilchard, just slightly different coloration on them. So yeah, that's kind of our our bait is anywhere from an inch to those big spawning pilchers will get about 6 inches or so.
Wow, nice. And so when you were talking about the commercial fishermen at the beginning of COVID, not being able to fish the way that they normally did, and that it gave the bait fish kind of a reprieve. Tell me what their program is. Are they going out? Are they cast netting the bait? Are they like, what are they
Yep.
doing? How do they fish?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I see a lot is they go out and they cast net inshore, and they'll try to get anywhere from a couple hundred to, depending on if it's a bigger boat, maybe 1,000 sprat. And then it's a couple different things. So some guys will kind of stick a little bit more inshore, and they'll go out, into maybe 30, 40 foot of water, and they'll just start chumming up snappers.
Muttons, probably, right?
And yeah, muttons. We've got, a lot. We got basically 5 types of snapper here that are pretty common. Muttons being the biggest of the snapper.
Cuberas?
And
Do
then
you see those?
we do. Yeah, we have them. They are, we've caught a couple babies in the mangroves.
Mm-hmm.
I know a few guys that have caught some, 40, 50 pounders at night, doing some night fishing, because that's typically when they fire up out here. But yeah, for the most part, these guys are going offshore. So I almost rarely ever see commercial guys fish in the areas that I'm fishing. I see them come in, grab their bait, and then they disappear into the horizon. And then you've got other guys that are still using those pilchards to go after the pelagics as well.
Mm-hmm.
Tuna's huge, especially for restaurants, mahi, wahoo. Those are, quality, high-priced fish. So you get into those, you can make a lot of money as a commercial fisherman here.
Boy, I tell you what, like what you're describing is a dream come true for, like the type of fishing that we do in the Florida Keys. It's the same thing. We cast net bait and we'll fish with it inshore, or the offshore fishermen come in and do exactly what you're talking about. They come in, they catch bait in the shallow flats, and then they take off, and you don't know exactly where they're going. But
Right.
now that I've done a lot more offshore fishing, I do know where they're going now, and they're doing some amazing, incredible things with those pilchards and bringing entire tuna schools up to the surface. They're doing incredible things, and what intrigued me there was the fact that you have an entire fleet, and you have a pilchard population that can sustain that, because that fishing using pilchards and having boats with live wells capable of carrying 1,000 pilchards, that doesn't happen everywhere, right? Like sometimes, they might catch the bait in certain places that I've been, but they don't keep it alive. They fish dead bait. But to be able to live chum pilchards, that's what we do in the Keys. And that's how lots of fly world records have come from, that technique of chumming these fish up and throwing a fly to them offshore. Everything, wahoo, sailfish, mahi, tuna, name it. I mean, every fish that lives out there loves pilchards, and even yellowtailing. When we go yellowtailing, we get pilchards before we go yellowtailing, and it just fires everything up. So, like for what you're doing on the inshore side, fly fishing for permit, tarpon, bonefish, snook, and then what, redfish? Do you have redfish?
No, unfortunately, we don't. Reds don't get this far.
Okay.
So yeah, we don't get reds or trout.
So,
it's really
but the
those
mutton
big four.
snapper though, you could probably do permit, tarpon, bonefish, snook, mutton snapper. That'd be a pretty awesome slam.
Yep.
But the ability to go inshore with you a couple of days and then go offshore and maybe chum up some fish offshore, and what gets me excited is that, like, we have plenty of that deep water chumming for like tuna and everything else that's out there, but what I've seen in the Bahamas a couple times before and other places is there's that shallow water chumming that you're talking about, where you get in 30 feet of water and you're getting these giant snappers coming to the surface and eating, and you can catch them on fly. That is, man, that sounds amazing. But so does your inshore fishing. Like your what you're talking about, fishing the sargassum weed and the tarpon and the permit and the snook and all that stuff. That sounds amazing. You could put together a really amazing trip here, is what I'm gathering from this interview. And I didn't know some of this. I didn't know that you had that offshore fleet, and I didn't know that you had snook there either. Like,
oh yeah,
there's a lot to be discovered in Saint Croix. So what's the history of Saint Croix? It's a U.S. territory, but has it changed hands a few times? Has it been a British colony? Like, do you know the history of it?
I do, yeah. So there's a great book by a historian down here called The Eight Flags. And so basically his book goes and documents the 8 different nations that ran Saint Croix at some point in history. One of those 8 being pirates as well. So this was a huge, Saint Croix is, again, it's very isolated. If you go south of Saint Croix, the next land you will find is Venezuela. So if you are, sailing back in the day and you miss somehow Puerto Rico and you miss the BVIs and St. Thomas, St. John, which is kind of all connected, if you get to St. Croix, you're good. If you pass St. Croix, you're in trouble. Mm-hmm. And so, basically a lot of pirates would use this island to ransack the Spanish on the South Shore of Puerto Rico. So we had French, we had English, we had Danish, we had Dutch, Knights of Malta even on this island. And so eventually it ends up in the Danish hands. And after World War I, the United States is worried that Germany might start to buy up islands in the Caribbean to use as military bases. And so we purchased the islands in the 1920s from the Danish for, I think, about $25 million in gold. Which would be about 800 or 900 million today if you held that gold for 100 years. And so basically, a little bit of history. It actually, what's really neat about Saint Croix is if you go back and you try to find some documentation on kind of the first fishing that was happening here, the first thing you'll find is the 1950s. And there's a guy, a pretty famous guy named Ted Williams, who actually discovered St. Croix in the 50s. And he would stay in King Christian, in Christiansted, which is kind of our main, call it a capital city. It's our main, we have 2 big cities here. That's our main city. And he would go out with one of the local park rangers to our southeast shore, the flats over there that I fish today that are loaded with fish. And he would go out after bonefish. And actually, there's a few articles that had him stating that St. Croix was the best bone fishing he had ever experienced in his life. And Ted Williams is no chump when it comes to fishing. A lot of people know him, 19-time All-Star. I'm a Connecticut guy, big Red Sox fan. So, to me, I argue he might be the best hitter of all time. But he was actually a Hall of Fame fly angler as well. And he set dozens of world records on the fly back when he was fishing. And one of the really interesting things here, and this kind of blew my mind when I learned it, is if you're ever down here and you see some of these older gentlemen still doing the hand lines, the big spools, they just kind of whip it out and just let it sit on the bob and wait for stuff to eat it. If you talk to them about bonefish here, they might give you a blank stare. And we might be part of the United States, but Crucian culture is very unique. It was a huge sugar plantation island. And so you had a lot of Europeans as well as Africans brought here to work and run the sugarcane plantations. And so there's actually a really strong culture here. St. Croix is one of the first islands to have basically a slave revolt that shut down all of the plantations here. And so we've got an awesome mix of Afro-Caribbean, Dominican, even Puerto Rican folks that live here. So it's really a bit of a melting pot, as well as obviously people from the States and from Europe, some of those older families. And so what's really cool is that, you have different names for fish down here. So when you're talking to these older local guys, they'll call permit cobbler, they'll call creval, covali, and then the bonefish. The bonefish name here is the 10-pounder. And when I heard that, I asked the guy and I said, 10-pounder, I've never heard a fish be named after a size like that, like I feel like calling a fish the 36-incher. So I asked the guy, what does that really mean? Were they big? Like, were they 10 pounds? And he just takes his finger and he points to the tip of his index finger and he traces a line all the way back to his shoulder. And he said about yay big.
Wow.
So about the length of a man's arm. And I think that's why Ted Williams said that this was some of the best bone fishing in the world, because to have a a fish we called the 10-pounder. That's not a 1 in 100 catch. You're catching that pretty consistently. So that was, one of the first things where I realized there's something unique happening on this island here. But unfortunately, that fishery never became what it could have been. So in the 50s, you have Ted Williams documented down here. In the 60s, they decided to industrialize the South Shore. And the site that they chose to industrialize was a 700-acre mangrove lagoon, the largest mangrove lagoon on the island. And they put in the world's largest oil refinery in the Western Hemisphere, and they put in one of the largest aluminum refineries in the Caribbean.
Wow.
And both of those places basically dredged up all of the mangroves, backfilled the channels, and, well, they weren't well regulated. Let's just put it that way. So from the 60s to the 70s to the 80s, they did a lot of things that we didn't find out about until the 90s and early 2000s. But long story short, that destroyed probably the biggest nursery on our island. And what it also did is our entire South Shore is one contiguous flat that has maybe 20 different bays. But if you were to trace the fringe and coral reef line, that will be anywhere from a quarter mile to 2 miles out to sea, depending on which bay you're in. That reef line will run the 23-mile South Shore. That is something you do not see in St. Thomas. You do not see in St. John. You don't see it even in Vieques or Culebra. And that South Shore is where I'd fish 90% of the time.
Wow.
But when they did build that refinery, they created these 30, 40-foot deep water shipping channels, 6 or 7 of them. And what it basically did is it split the island in half. There's a lot of studies that show that fish do not like going over deep channels. That's where the kudas are. That's where the hammerheads are. And so basically what I think it did is it broke the island in half. You probably had fish that would swim from the east side to the west side and back. And now they basically swim 12 miles. They hit these massive jetties, these deep water man-made channels, and they just stop and probably turn around. So that was a huge impact to our fishery here. And then in the 70s, 80s, gill nets became really popular. That was, a little bit of a newer invention. It came to the Caribbean again around the 70s and 80s. And the issue with the gill nets is we had so many bonefish still. You can't kill an entire species just in a few years. But you can obviously start to impact it. And so you already had the mangroves gone, the nursery gone. And then the issue with the gill nets and the bonefish, I don't know if you've ever tried to cast net a bonefish, would not recommend it. They go berserk. And imagine catching a 10, 12-pound bonefish in a net. That net is going to get mangled, ripped, broken. And there's very, very little, meat quality. I mean, there's so many bones. There's a few ways that I've learned that they basically mush the fish down and create little fish cakes. Mm-hmm. But long story short, it wasn't a fish they wanted to catch. So there's stories of people throwing dozens and dozens of bonefish up on the beach because they were so tired of them ruining their gear, costing them money, costing them time. And so basically by 1993, when Dr. Aaron Adams actually from Bonefish Tarpon Trust started out as a marine biologist down here, he's got a few articles that he's quoted saying that he had to fly to St. John to get his first bonefish because They were gone. They were completely disappeared. And that's probably why almost everyone listening to this has never heard of Saint Croix as a bonefish spot. Because by the 90s, with the South Shore Industrial Complex, with the gill netting that happened, the bonefish population disappeared almost entirely.
Wow.
And so that it's used a lot as an example of how quickly you can take a world-class fishery and bring it to the point of oblivion, basically, or non-existence.
Mm-hmm. So that's the bad side of it. How does it return? How do you regain that fishery? That's
so the good news is, so that's the bad news. The good news is in 2001, the aluminum refinery finally got caught for all the things that it did, and it got sued by the EPA, and it closed the next day. And then in 2004, the Caribbean Management Fishery Council declares tarpon and bonefish illegal to kill. puts a moratorium on taking tarpon and bonefish in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And then in 2006, which quite frankly, gill nets had gone out of style before that, but in 2006, gill nets are officially banned in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And then in 2012, the oil refinery again gets sued by the EPA and declares bankruptcy the next day and leaves island. So within a span from 2001 to 2012, a 10-year span, all of the things that I just mentioned on paper get fixed. Wow. So the industrial complex is a shell of what it is. It's no longer polluting. You finally got basically some court cases in. So they had to spend $40-50 million cleaning up a lot of the toxins that they put into our salt ponds and the lagoons and the channels. So by about 2014, from a legal standpoint, everything is now officially clean and healthy. And so that, I think, is really the turning point. And if you think about, especially with bonefish, we know they live about 23 years, maybe even a little bit longer. But if you think about 2024, and we go back to 2001 when that aluminum plant closed, that's about one, full generation of bonefish later. And a lot of the fish we're probably getting today were born within the last 10 years, maybe even the last 5 years. And so I think that was a huge turning point for this island starting to pick up again and starting to rebound when it comes to the inshore scene here.
Wow, that's really cool. It always goes back to just, we've had different things in the United States here with the redfish, and they were fishing for mullet so aggressively that it was really damaging to the redfish, and they stopped all that. And it wasn't long after that the redfish rebound to an incredible level. I mean, the red fishing now all over the state of Florida and many other places is so good. And but that's a fish that was on the brink of not being around, maybe, or not being very good, and it was very difficult to find them for a long time. But if you give nature a chance and you set the regulations, you can see some amazing things. So that's a great story of what happened there, and hopefully it doesn't repeat itself in other places. But what goes on with that refinery and all that closed down? Is the building still there? Is what happens with all that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, we actually are still right now. There's still a lot of political will trying to reopen the refinery.
Really?
So we had a company come in and open the refinery a few years ago and restart production, and within a couple years they had basically made so many mistakes, spewed a lot of oil all over the South Shore. EPA came in. It's one of the only times the EPA has actually used the Clean Air Act to shut down a refinery. And so they were shut down. They sold at auction for like $60 million. And we're talking about a refinery that at one point refined 20% of all gasoline in the United States.
Wow.
Like, we're talking one of the largest refineries in the world. Even today, if it was to reopen, it would still be in the top 15. And so there's still a lot of political, it was a huge job creator. You got to look at it from the other side too. This island was at one point one of the richest islands in the Caribbean because of that refinery and because of the high paying jobs. And then gas was so cheap here because you had so much of it. Energy was cheap. So the island really could thrive. And so there's still a lot of people that want to bring Saint Croix back to that kind of quote unquote glory day of the 70s, where you had well-paying jobs. You had a lot of businesses that were, feeding and clothing and doing trips and excursions with the folks, from the oil rigs of Texas and Louisiana that would come down here as well. So there's still a lot of political pressure to open that refinery again. But this time the EPA has got them on the top of their watch list. Whereas back in the day, the EPA never even came down here for probably 20, 30 years to check anything. So there's still pressure to keep industrializing here, but there's a lot of locals that no longer want that because they've dealt with the fallout, and they don't want their cisterns full of gas again. They don't want to have to, clean their roofs because oil droplets are all over them and, all over their cars, and creating all of this smog and other kind of negative impacts that you get from heavy refining.
So the opposition, when you're trying to avoid that, they've already been through it once and they've seen what happens, and they don't want that again. There's a big economic boom if you reopen it. Is the opposition now that we can keep the island super clean and bring tourists here, and that's going to replace the economic loss
Yep.
from the refinery? Is that because that's what you typically it's got to come down? It comes down to money sooner or later.
Right.
Like
It absolutely comes down to
group
money.
one group wants to bring in the oil. The other group wants to bring in tourism. One group wants to bring in the cruise ships. One group wants to keep them out. I don't know. You always see these different things, but it comes down to that's a tremendous amount of money that could come into that community. So the opposition has to address that. Like, if we're not going to bring this in through oil, how will we bring it in? I'm just curious of what that kind of temperature is there. Seems like that would be a real dividing line between locals.
Yeah, it absolutely is. You've got folks that, again, it's all about economy and jobs, and you got folks that are saying, hey, the reason that they didn't do this on St. Thomas was because they didn't want St. Thomas to be inundated in a negative way when it comes to tourism. Well, now Saint Croix, a lot of my clients are first timers to Saint Croix, and there's been a change. St. Thomas is real built up. You can have 2, 3, 4 cruise ships in a day. You can have 20,000 people on cruise ships. Saint Croix, you come here and it's like the country. We like to say St. Thomas is the city, St. Croix is the country. And so a lot of people like the slower, laid back vibe, kind of the longer, less built up island. And, that is really driving a lot of tourism today. People don't want to necessarily go and stay at the Ritz-Carlton anymore. Yes. You got those folks, but you got a lot of folks that say, give me a boutique, give me some unique nature, give me just my own beach that doesn't have 300 people on it. And that's where Saint Croix is really appealing to folks. And then the other piece, honestly, about the refinery here is it's never going to be it's a shell of what it was. I mean, it laid idle on a salty ocean for 7-8 years. If you drive by it, it looks like an apocalyptic movie set. And I've always said they should just film movies there. I mean, it's rusted. You've got huge piles of waste. I mean, it's been picked through and scrapped to the point where it really is a massive eyesore, and it's extremely difficult to restart it. That's why they had issues when they tried to do it prior, because you let something sit for a year here, it's going to be rusted. You let something sit for several years right on the ocean, and good luck.
Anyone listening to this that owns a boat, that boat does not get used very often, knows that if it's around salt water and the best thing you can do for a boat is use it every single day. And when you let one sit, everything rusts, everything breaks, everything. That's the worst thing you can do to a boat, to a house, to a oil refinery, is lack of use around salt water. Like that is, it's a killer. Like for anything, for your swing set in your backyard, for anything, like it's just going to rust away in the Keys environment, in the St. Croix environment. Like it's that I can't imagine that they could even ever get it restarted. Maybe, you can do a lot with money, I guess, but
yeah, I don't think it's going to get restarted personally, but we'll see. There's a lot of court cases right now, so they got to get through the EPA, and then we'll see.
Super interesting history, and you are doing a really good job of being the Tourist Development Council for St. Croix as far as anglers go, because like everything that you've told me sounds like paradise. You don't have very many people there. The fishing is amazing. You can fish inshore, you can fish offshore. You have tremendous history, and it's just it seems like just a super cool place. I'm definitely going to come. I'm going to come with my wife. She just had a hip replacement, so as soon as she starts feeling better, we're gonna come down there. I'm going to fish with you, and that sounds amazing. I love the history there. That's super cool. We have a lot of the same type. Anywhere in the Caribbean, you're going to have a lot of the same type of history. You're going to have some pirate history. You're going to have some celebrity kind of things. But a couple of things that you talked about, Ted Williams had a presence in the Florida Keys. He wrote a book called The Big Three, which ironically was not permit tarpon bonefish. it was tarpon, bonefish, and Atlantic salmon was the book that he wrote about. And those were what he called the big three. Then, and back when he was fishing, they probably didn't fish for permit much. Like it's just a fish that kind of like we look at parrotfish tailing or something, or triggerfish tailing for a long time. It's like, I don't know what, those aren't bonefish. Go over here. These are bonefish over here, right? You just avoid them. But then sooner or later you figure out how to fish for them, and then they become a real target. And I think that's the way that permit were for a long time. But Ted Williams had a presence in the Keys, and then one of the things that got us to do this podcast together is we've been talking over text, and one of the things that you said was that you had listened to the Mike Larkin podcast, where he came on. He's been on so many times, but he's a man that has a tremendous amount of knowledge about bonefish and many other species. And you were able to learn some things from that podcast, and I would like to know what they were and how you applied them to your fishery. And you said that you've stayed in touch with Mike Larkin after that, right?
Yes.
That's so cool.
Yeah, he's an awesome, brilliant man.
Yeah, that's so cool. So, like, what kind of things when you hear somebody talk about bonefish and stuff, and of course, Aaron Adams also has been on this podcast too, but in a clean water kind of thing rather than a bonefish science type thing. But what kind of things did you learn from the podcast we did with Mike Larkin? Yeah,
so to kind of preface this, so when I went into listening to that podcast because I had stumbled upon a picture from a few years back from one of the guides with a bonefish with a rapala sticking out of its mouth. And so I had called the guide. I knew him. I had been fishing with him before. I called him up and I said, "Hey man, I saw this photo from like 2017, 16. There's a bonefish with a rapala in its mouth. Like, was that just a random one-off? Like, what was going on there? I've never seen a rapala bonefish setup before." And so he started telling me a few things that really kind of started blowing my mind a little bit. And when it really all clicked is when I listened to that podcast. And what I really was so surprised about was his study on growth rates and diet. I think that is like the most interesting study I think anyone's done on bonefish to date. I love the spawning studies. I love a lot of the other studies, but the Bahamas versus Florida Keys growth rate, absolutely incredible. And I think, so for folks that may not have listened to that podcast, there was one thing that really stuck out to me. And we were talking about what is the age of a 10-pound bonefish, right? And so Dr. Larkin had basically found in his study that in the Bahamas, on average, those 10-pounders can be around 16 years old. They're a little bit slower growing there. They're on that benthic diet, that bottom feeding diet. And when he looked at the Florida Keys, and this will really shock me, he was saying that you could potentially find 10-pounders as young as 6 years old. Wow. So he was seeing, a 2.67 time greater growth rate in the Florida Keys. And one of the main things that was talked about was in the Florida Keys, you've got this fish. We don't have them down here. I think it's called a toadfish.
Yes.
Is it?
Mm-hmm.
And he was saying that when those bigger bones start to get on those toadfish, the calorie content that they can get from those fish really increases the growth rate exponentially. I mean, we're talking 267% faster. Like if that's a stock, you are rich, yes. Right? So, I mean, that is an incredible way to speed up the growth rate. And in my experience down here, I had only ever caught 4 or 5 pound bonefish. And so in my mind, I was still under the kind of more pessimistic impression that we're catching old bones. I'm not seeing the 1, 2, 3 pounders. So this fishery's in trouble. Like, we're catching fish that were born 10, 15 years ago, and we're kind of catching the older fish. But what I think was really kind of crazy is I don't think that's exactly what's happening here. And in fact, I know that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is these bonefish are eating pilchards, and not just 2-3 inch pilchards. I'm talking 4 or 5 inch pilchards, which just how a bonefish can actually eat a pilchard, with the mouth being underneath them, That's pretty incredible. Turns out that they actually get above the bait and they dive bomb it because they're not like a tarpon. They're not like a snook. They can't come up and just create that vacuum and suction everything into the mouth. And one of the things in that podcast is that bonefish can see straight and down, whereas tarpon see straight and up. So that's an interesting piece, is basically if a bonefish wants to eat a bait fish, it has to be eye level or above it. And that's something that's pretty unique. And that also is one of the reasons why I don't see that many tailing bonefish here.
Huh.
There's a few spots where I see tails consistently, and they're going after these ghost shrimp that burrow in the sand right on the beach, kind of where the waves come up, and kind of churn that sand up, and the bonefish use those waves to help kind of undig those shrimp. But if a bonefish is feeding on bait fish, you're not going to know unless you start to really get into the ecosystem and start to see, okay, this is what it looks like when a bonefish is eating bait fish. And
what does it look like?
All you see are these little, it's almost like big raindrops. These, I call them pitses, just this little pit, 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 pit. And you don't really see the fish, you don't see any tail coming out. If it was a tarpon or a snook, the snook, they make that really unique snook sound when they come up and hit something on the surface. Tarpon here are flying out the water when they're feeding, so it's really easy to see a tarpon feed. And so basically, you just see this bait going crazy, but it's not jumping like a jack would run through it and it makes the fish fly everywhere. All you're seeing is just this little bit of a surface disturbance, and there's a lot of bait around. And that's because those bonefish, they can't eat off the surface. They probably don't eat anywhere within 18 inches of the surface. They're eating pretty much that middle water column and down. And when I see this behavior, I would say it's anywhere from 2.5 to maybe 6 or 7 feet deep. So we're still talking pretty shallow, but we're not necessarily talking like a flat. Maybe more of a beach that kind of slowly kind of tapers off and then forms a flat around 8 or 10 feet. So we call it maybe a little bit of a deeper water flat for down here. And so I got to see this really well this past month with the sargassum. And I think this is what's crazy. I don't know many places, and tell me if I'm wrong, where you can go for tarpon. And I had a bunch of military guys down here doing some training with the Air Force National Reserve here, and brought them out fishing. And we were going for tarpon, and we were cooking up the tarpon. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we just start catching bonefish. We didn't change our lure setups. We're using 50-pound leaders. We're using 4-inch swim baits, big half-ounce bucktails for these tarpon. And all of a sudden, these guys start hooking up to bonefish.
How big a bonefish is eating a 5-inch swim bait?
Anywhere, it's incredible. As small as 3 pounds. But typically, the bonefish here are around 5 pounds. Basically, what I would say is a fish under 24 inches is what I would consider small here. A fish over 24 inches is bigger, and then anything over probably that 26 mark, 7-8 pounders, that's when I start to say that's a big bonefish. But I would say, yeah, almost every bonefish we've caught's been between 4 and 6, wow. 80%.
And so, do you ever see, like you say, you don't see many bonefish tailing? And the bonefish that you do see tailing, are they the really big ones, or are they the smaller ones, or like? Is there any correlation to the size of fish that you're seeing tailing?
Yeah, so actually my best tailing spot is the same spot that I've been fishing for the tarpon and the bones. And so because that sargassum's all along the edge there, those fish can't go and eat those shrimp right now. So they've switched on to the anchovies, and they've switched on to the sprat that are around. So it's the same fish that I see tailing 10 months out of the year. And then for those 2 months that the sargassum's inundating the flat, those fish are off that sargassum edge feeding pretty consistently on bait fish. So, in that bay, I've actually had the chance to go snorkeling one day when it was real clear, and I found about 300-400 bonefish schooled up on a real clear day. How deep
the water was it?
4 feet.
4 feet.
Maybe 30 foot off the beach.
There's a big group of bonefish, and what are they doing when you find them? Just chilling out, or they're
just chilling. And in fact, I actually think when it gets real calm, real crystal clear, I think they become prey. So they were schooling like a bait ball. they were rolling and flashing. Like you'll see bait, flashing. You'll see other fish that will roll on their side and kind of give you that. I don't know if it's a warning to the school that there's this, human that's pretty close. Could be a shark.
You don't think that that's a feeding behavior? Because we see that too. Like when you see a group of fish and you see the flashing on the side, and sometimes that's all you see. Like you're looking over a flat, and for so long, maybe 2.5 feet deep, nobody's tailing, nobody's throwing any kind of wake, but you just see this one little mirror for just like a split second. You're almost like, did I see that? Like, and you're looking and you don't see it again. And then,
right.
But if you know what you're looking for, that's where they are. And if you go up there and you get closer, you'll see them mudding and things like that. But it's that one little flash that you saw that occasionally can be the telltale sign how you can find that school. Otherwise, you weren't going to see them, right? That's
right. Absolutely. And actually, I just posted a little YouTube short which shows exactly what you just said. And that was in the Sargassum, watching a pack of bones, probably 7 or 8 of them, pretty big. I'd say they were 4 to 7 pounders. And, it's a little hard to pick up on the camera, but what you see clear as day is that flashing as they're rolling by. Mm-hmm. And then not a second later, you look over to the left and you're seeing those pitses. So they're coming like packs and they're schooling. But I also saw it when they were just schooled up, 200, 300, 400 deep. And what's interesting to me is, it's in theory, they say, when those fish get bigger, they start to become more solitary. What was interesting about this school is they were as small as 2 pounds, and there were some fish that I would put conservatively at 10, if not 12, 14 pounders. Nice. I mean, super large fish. And those guys, when you kind of get near the school, they're shy, so they'll start swimming away. It's not something you typically do is snorkel with bonefish. They're not the most, human-friendly fish out there, pretty spooky fish. Mm-hmm. But those big ones, you can just tell that they're the big ones because they don't really run from you. The rest of the school will kind of move away 20 feet. They'll kind of linger slowly behind that school, just kind of living their best life. But I do think they school because there's some huge barracudas, and I've seen a few scarred up bonefish here. And I think when it gets crystal calm like that, they become the prey. Yeah. And I think it has to be a defense mechanism because they don't typically school like that. They're typically feeding. And when they're schooled like that, you won't see a single tail. Mm-hmm. You won't see a single fish feeding. And that's how they're probably schooled up.
Yeah. There's no doubt that's a defense mechanism from a lot of different fishes to ball up together. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if that's exactly the case of what you the fishery better than certainly better than me. But another thing that happens in those situations is some sort of a spawning behavior where they will stage up like that together. And who knows? That's why Bonefish Tarpon Trust and Mike Larkin and Aaron Adams and these other people are in business is because we don't know very much about the bonefish.
Right.
And so we learn things like what you're talking about. Bonefish are feeding in these deeper areas that, for the most part, not many people are looking for them. You figured it out with catching them on Rapalas, which is amazing. How many are you catching on the Rapalas? Can you do that regularly, or is it kind of a thing that you're tarpon fishing and you just catch one, or are you targeting them with lures?
Targeting them with lures. And so actually I've got one here. This has been my best producer. Nice. This is a 4-inch. You've probably seen this bait before. It's the most basic
Scoot it
bait
over
out
a little
there.
bit. There you go, right there. It's in the middle.
All right, right there. Yeah. So this is the 4-inch wild eye storm shad. You could throw this for bass. You could throw this for stripers. You could throw this for just about anything. I've even had permit eat this. But what's amazing is this is the 1/2 ounce. And so when I started, we started catching them on the smaller one. We started catching them on this little 3-inch 1/4 ounce. And this is what works real well in skinny water. And actually, this is what we troll. So we've caught about 6 or 7 bonefish trolling off the kayaks using these guys, which is pretty crazy.
Awesome.
Yeah. You could
so
catch a
awesome.
mutton, a barracuda, a jack, or a bonefish.
Do you have wire?
These days.
Are you using wire too?
No. I'm usually using 30 to 50 pound fluoro. Okay. Typically,
bonefish will eat wire. They will eat it. I've caught them on
Interesting.
wire.
Okay. Yeah. I didn't know that.
I would think that if they're going to eat that thing, they're going to eat it with 40-pound fluorocarbon, or they're going to eat it with wire. They'll eat it either way, I think.
Yeah.
And then
Oh,
then
yeah.
you won't get snipped off every time a cuda eats it, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, so this 4-inch one, this is what we caught our bonefish on when we were tarpon fishing. So tarpon loved this one. I've got one other jig. She's a little bit beat up. Lost a few feathers here.
Yeah. That's much more like what we fish with. And you know, so I fished with this guy, his name was Mitch Howell, and he was the best I had ever seen at this, and he would always come in these tournaments and he would win, you know, the artificial division, and he would always catch bonefish. And I finally had the opportunity to fish with him, and we fished a number of tournaments together. And I was so excited to fish with him because I wanted to see what in the world he was doing catching these fish on jigs. And I thought maybe they were targeting these fish on jigs, but we would basically go to any area where we were going to catch bonefish, and we would tailing fish or where we're going to see them in shallow water, and he would have a couple of rods, and he would have one with a sight casting shrimp, right? You know, just a shrimp hooked up like everybody else has, but then he would have another rod with a jig on it, kind of like what you just showed me, that bucktail
like
jig,
the bucktails.
but a smaller hook and it was a little bit smaller. And, you know, like anytime you're pulling down the flat, there's going to be an area that has glare, right? You can't see very far into the glare. And he would just throw into that glare, always, straight into the glare, because we could see everywhere else. Yeah, we could see. Yeah. He would let me look out in front of the boat to where I could see, you know, from the polling tower. I could see pretty far out there. He can see pretty far out there, but there was a whole area that we couldn't see at all. And he would target that area with the jig, blind casting the jig. And dude, it was good for 3 or 4 fish every single time. And, you know, and I'm watching how he's doing it. I'm like, that doesn't seem like the same thing that we're trying to do when we're fly fishing for them or whatever. And we're imitating this thing that goes down to the bottom. The fish comes up to it and we move it out of the way. Like it just got scared and the bonefish jumps all over it. Right. With a jig, they were definitely chasing it down and they were definitely eating it. And it was in the same areas that they were doing all of this other stuff, but we couldn't see them. But we would catch a lot of fish that way. And the reason I know that they will eat wire is because there would also be these, you know, anything from 12-inch to 24-inch barracudas all over the flats up there, right? You probably have the same thing going on.
Oh, yeah.
And so we're throwing those jigs. Well, those barracudas love those jigs. And so,
they do.
You know, we would throw out there and snip. You know, you'd just get a little bump and no jig. Then you'd have to tie another one on, and we'd go through 24 jigs. I'm like, I'm putting wire on there. I'm gonna put some wire on there. I can't go through 24 jigs every time I come out here, right? So I just put a little wire on there, and I'm thinking, you know, this will be fun for the other guy to catch a few barracudas, right? We'll just keep the rod bent. It'll be fun, and then we'll just be really looking for the bonefish. Well, sure enough, first bite, bonefish on the wire. Like, oh, that's weird. Then it just didn't seem to matter. Like that thing's moving and they're not getting a real good look at it anyway. And they ate the wire just as good as the fluorocarbon. But I got a question about what you're talking about, these big raindrops and the way that you're seeing these bonefish tailing, or not tailing, but feeding in the deeper water. And you referred to it as big raindrops, and then you referred to it as something else.
I like to call it like a pits. I don't know. It's just
pits.
Like,
okay.
You know, it's like boop, 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 boop. Yeah. Like it's just these little like droplets.
Yeah. So, like when we're cast netting pilchards, that's what we look for. We look for that on slick, calm days. You see that happening. So when you're seeing this and you're associating it with bonefish feeding on these fish, do you think what you're seeing is the bait fish doing what they're doing, like when we're cast netting them and you just see the bait fish making these kind of raindrops? And it sounds like it's raining too sometimes. Like you can hear them and you hear like a little crack. The bait fish, the pilchards, will make like a little cracking sound. And then, you know, the guys that are good at throwing the cast net, they're like, it was right over there. And you move the boat right over there, and then you're going to throw the net. But what you're seeing, are you seeing the bait fish making this disturbance that you're calling big raindrops or pits, or do you think it's the bonefish making that disturbance? Just want to be clear.
I think it's definitely the bonefish, because especially at the sargassum line that we've seen, that we were seeing in the last couple of weeks. You know, there's millions of bait on that line. You won't see anything, and then all of a sudden you'll just start seeing, And the thing that you also see along with it are the flashes of silver in the water, right? Because when those
Now, the bait fish flashes of silver, or the bonefish flashes of silver?
The bait fish in particular.
Okay.
And you'll start to see those bait fish freaking out, and then they'll go calm again. And you wouldn't know they were there unless you saw them. So for me, I would definitely say, I think, there's plenty of times where, pilchards are just doing what pilchards do. Like they stick on the top when they're spawning, they come up and they slap their tails.
Mm-hmm.
And, if you have spawning pilchards, you'll see that same pitching happening. Doesn't mean there's any fish there. But if we're not in spawning season, 100%. And
what do you consider spawning season? What months?
For us, March and April.
Okay. So any month outside of that, if you're seeing that behavior, you're pretty sure that it's bonefish feeding, or you can at least, you think they're bonefish underneath those.
Yeah.
And so you're throwing a Rapala into that and catching bonefish.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow,
and honestly,
so cool.
what I think is actually more fun. I'm a big spin guy personally, but fly fishing, mate. I mean, for bones, you can get a nice medium light setup and get a great spin setup going and get that reel screaming, but there's nothing better than fly fishing. And I think my favorite thing is, especially when I get the guys that, they're like, yeah, man, I caught, 20 bonefish in Belize. I've caught, 15 bonefish in the Bahamas. I've caught stuff on Christmas Island. They're world travel guys, and they come to me and they show up, and I've got something like this on, which is a EP minnow.
Yeah,
is what that guy is. Big EP minnow. This is what we use for snook and tarpon. But I'll put something like this on, or if we're in dirty water, we go black and purple. Because with the dirty water, all that matters is a profile, in my opinion, down
here.
You're
fishing that for bonefish. That's profile. Your go-to fly for bonefish.
This is my 6-pound killer. I mean, she's pretty rusted up, a little beat up, so she's kind of retired now. But this one,
say the water's 3 feet deep. Are you trying to keep that in the mid water column, or are you putting it on the bottom? You're getting it to go to the bottom.
Or mid water column. Yeah, mid water column. Yeah, and then these style baits. This is probably the most successful style bait that you can throw, fly that you can throw down here, because what is it? It's a pilchard. It's a greenback. Sometimes I have a couple that I like that are a little bit darker green.
Yep.
But that chartreuse, what I love about this one is that chartreuse gets seen in that tannic water. So when we're fishing, muddy conditions or deltas from salt ponds that are bringing out tannic nutrient rich water, and basically you'll have like crystal clear water next to dirty water.
Yes.
These are fantastic. And so really, like, this is probably the number one style fly to throw here. And what's amazing for anything.
Well, I can see for it. You don't even have to explain it for everything else, but for bonefish, just to be clear, that's what you're throwing, because I can guarantee you that if you go to Christmas Island, the only reason that you have that in there is you might see a small trevally that you're trying to throw to. You don't throw that at bonefish.
Yeah.
But what I think is so interesting about this conversation is that when you're telling me all of these things, I'm thinking back. My friend Simon Becker, who's one of the best guides in the Florida Keys, he tells me his story about catching his first bonefish, and he was just going out to this beach in the Florida Keys to catch anything, right? And so he comes from an offshore background, and he wires together 2 deceivers, basically the same fly that you just showed me. He wires them together because he thinks he's going to catch maybe barracuda, maybe a Jack Crevalle or whatever. So it's on wire, then there's wire between the 2 deceivers, and it's not 1 deceiver like you're holding up, but 2. So 2.
Right.
And he throws out he sees a splash or some sort of disturbance, throws out there and catches a bonefish. It was the first bonefish that he ever caught. And you think about it as a fluke, like caught this bonefish on a deceiver. But then you're like, okay, well, I want to catch more bonefish. So you start digging into the books and talking to people, and they're like, no, man, you don't use that. You use this, like this crab fly or this, this shrimp pattern or anything.
Yep.
And so all of a sudden you found something that was, in my experience, fishing, there are no flukes. Like if you caught that fish on a deceiver, there's a reason why. That fish didn't just bite that out of... I mean, maybe you had no idea that you were fishing for bonefish, but you caught one on a deceiver. That's not a fluke. That's not a fluke.
Right.
Those fish are feeding on bait fish in that area. But then when you're like, okay, well, I really want to dig into this and find out more, everything points you to that was a fluke, and you really need to be doing it this way. 99% of the bonefish are caught this way. Well, maybe that's because we just don't think about fishing them the other way. And what I think is the most interesting thing about this is, like, when you're telling me this and you're telling me about the way that you're targeting and things that you're seeing, I've seen those same things, but I don't associate it with bonefish. I associate it with, I don't know, I got to move through this area to get up there where the bonefish are real shallow, right? But you could be passing over all of these opportunities that you don't even know about. Like recently, we went to we were filming a show, and it'll be for next year. But we go to this this mud, and it's what we thought was a mullet mud, right? Do you have mullet down there?
We have mullet in certain areas, yes.
And do they make muds and just it just stays kind of cloudy for a while? But I'm sure you have bonefish muds too, right? Like.
Sometimes.
Okay, yeah.
I don't see it too often, but sometimes, yeah.
Well, in the Bahamas, you'll see like bonefish muds, and they will stay there for a long time, like all day.
Yeah.
And if you go over there and you cast into the muds, you catch a bonefish almost every time, right? And
right.
It's so much so that a lot of people have to tell their guides, like, I want to catch bonefish, but I don't want to go to the muds, right? It's super popular, but you're not sight fishing. You could just sit there and catch them as many as you want, pretty much. And so some people would be like, well, that's fun for 5 minutes, but I don't want to do that all day, so I want to go sight fishing. Well, we found this mud, and we've always associated these muds with mullet. And but we start throwing out there, my friend Jeff Malone, he says, well, I caught 22 bonefish yesterday, or some crazy number.
Sure.
And then I find out later that it's in a mud. But he was not fishing for bonefish when he was doing this. He just had people out there trying to bend the rod, jacks, ladyfish, whatever's in there. But then you start catching these bonefish. So then we go back. I wonder if that's a fluke. Catch more bonefish in these areas, and it's like, well, maybe these aren't mullet muds at all. Maybe these are bonefish muds. We've just thought that they were mullet muds, and 100 boats run by. And looking for something else. Never stop. But even then, it's like, okay, well, if you threw in there with a jig, you're more than likely to catch a ladyfish immediately because they're more aggressive. But if you throw out there and you let it go to the bottom and then you kind of move it slow, we were able to catch bonefish. So the point I'm making is that you have pioneered this fishery down there where now you're 100% confident that what you're seeing is bonefish, and you're actually targeting them on lures or streamers on fly, and you've honed in on how these bonefish are feeding on bait fish, and you're fishing in different areas than someone who believes that bonefish only feed on shrimp and crabs in shallow water. Right. So when I think about that, like, one of the most interesting things to me about any kind of fishing is taking what somebody knows about a certain area and then applying it to another area. And I mean, my head's just spinning of different things that we could try in different places that may have the same kind of thing going on. And if, of course, Mike Larkin's already proven that bonefish are eating these toadfish and pilchards and other things in the Florida Keys. Yep. So why couldn't we find these situations? It seems like we would be able to.
The only other place that I know that's very well documented is Los Roques in Venezuela. And so those guys, they're on glass minnows. So they're on, smaller, skinnier minnows. But I mean, the pelicans, like they do what our tarpon do with the pelicans here down there. So if you've got pelicans diving, like down there, you most likely got bonefish on there. And so a lot of guys that I know that have fish there will say that you can catch them on, little 2-3 inch, silver bait fish flies and lures like that. But what I've never heard is like 4 or 5. I mean, one story, which is real quick, is we were fishing this flat for tarpon, and I had these like 4-inch dead sprat, because sometimes the tarpon here, they'd rather eat a dead sprat than one that's moving. They're just super lazy and, whatever. The bite kind of slows down. We're fishing this flat that's got these kind of deep kind of cuts in it. So, you got maybe 10, 12 inches of grass flat, and then you get this bigger sand pocket. The bite kind of slowed, so we started kind of walking back. I had seen one bonefish in this big pothole as we were walking by. I went back to that pothole, threw out bobber, sprat, 1/0 circle hook, gave it like 30, 40 seconds in the pothole. And I was like, okay, let's keep going. So my client's reeling it in, and it gets about 7 feet, 6 feet from us. Not one, but two big bonefish are chasing this thing like a brown trout would chase, a dead bait that you're working like a lure or something. I tell the guy, pause. He pauses it. One of those bonefish just lightning quick, just runs, hits that pilchard. And the next thing, for the next like 50 seconds, I've just got this little trout bobber with this 4-inch bonefish, 4-inch bait fish dangling out of the mouth of the bone. And he's just zipping all across the flat. And this isn't a thing that I've seen here alone. I mean, I would say, based off my experience, you could probably use these techniques almost anywhere in the Caribbean. Any of these Caribbean islands, because I know I've got a buddy in St. John who told me his biggest bonefish was on a dead sprat.
Wow.
And, I think it's a little bit, I don't think it's probably true that we are so unique that we're the only place in the world where this is happening. We might be the only place where we're consistently using these techniques every day. I couldn't tell you the last time I put on a shrimp or a crab pattern for bonefish. I mean, I just don't do it anymore. In fact, you give them a big old fly, you give them a bigger bait, kind of like a snook. They want those slightly bigger baits sometimes, and I think they just see a meal, and it's too tempting to pass up. Sometimes with those smaller jigs. I mean, I still use bugs jigs all the time, and we still sometimes use crab and shrimp patterns. You can catch them. It's not that you can't catch them traditionally. You absolutely can. But for me, you can catch them as good, if not better, on these bait fish patterns than you can on your traditional bonefish patterns.
Wow.
And why not catch them on a bait fish pattern if you can, right? You can catch them anywhere, on the other stuff. Like you come to Saint Croix, let's throw on those 2 to 4 to 5 inch, pilchard imitations, and let's have some fun.
That's so cool.
That's kind of how I think about it.
That's really cool. And I'll tell you what, the way that you described your home there, I think you're going to have some people coming. So we're going to tell people how they could reach you if they want to come down there and go fishing.
Yeah, definitely. So my company's called Silver Kings Kayak Charters. We're online, silverkingsvi.com. Also on Instagram and YouTube, Silver Kings VI. We have a lot of really cool stuff. You'll see some of our bonefish, been able to video some of the stuff we've talked about today.
You got YouTube or are you on Instagram?
Yeah, YouTube. YouTube and Instagram, Silver Kings VI, as in Virgin Islands. Okay.
Both are the same.
That's our tag. Yep. And then silverkingsvi.com is our main channel, and we're always updating it, with new photos, blogs, fishing techniques and tricks, what's working, what's not. So, we're always trying to provide a wealth of information for folks that are coming down here and may have no idea what they're getting into.
And so if you are coming down there, is there a certain area that you prefer your people to stay in, or is the island small enough that they can be anywhere and you can fish with them wherever they're staying, or how?
So
I'm
the
not
island's
familiar enough with the island yet.
Yeah. So the beauty of this island, that's a good point. So the beauty of the island, it's 23 miles long. So from tip to tip, you're talking maybe a 60-minute drive. So pretty much if you're staying, most of the best fishing is on the South Shore and out to the east. So staying around the Christiansted area, where quite frankly is where most of the tourists do stay. That would probably be the best spot. But I mean, even if you're way out west in Frederickstead, it's only a 40-minute, ride. I mean, I drive 40 minutes to my favorite beach, and it's a beautiful drive. I mean, we're talking like 2 stoplights the whole drive. It's just open. I mean, it's country roads, but on one side you have beautiful flats. On the other side, you've got agriculture. We're just missing corn mazes, and you could be back in the United States.
Dang.
But
sounds amazing,
so
man. Sounds
you can
amazing.
Live anywhere.
Yeah.
stay anywhere.
Okay, so we figured out how to do that, and typically on the podcast we have this thing called the hot seat, and typically we do it in the beginning, but we started out with such a good conversation that we're going to close out with the hot seat. But before we do, I wanted to mention that we are recording this on July 3rd, and on July 3rd. If anyone has been paying attention to the radar and what's going on in the tropics, there's been a very large, very aggressive hurricane that skirted you. Give us a little update on what that hurricane was before we close it out with a hot seat.
Yeah, so this is something that we're keeping our eye on here, because you may have heard this is the first Category 5 to ever form in June in the history of recording. So this is really rare. I kind of knew this was going to happen. Our surface temperatures in March were what they should have been in June. So we're about 3 months ahead of schedule from a water temperature perspective. And the tricky thing about these storms, so this storm really impacted what we call kind of the Windward Islands. So the bottom part of the archipelago, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, really devastating to see there. So, keeping them in prayers and thoughts for those guys as they recover. We've had a couple Category 5s through here, and it absolutely is devastating. Even with the backing of the United States, we still had no power for 6 to 8 months after Maria and Irma came through in 2017, wiped out St. Thomas, Saint Croix, and Puerto Rico. Probably remember those storms were pretty massive.
Yeah.
And that's something that is kind of scary a little bit, is this storm is 200 to 300 miles south of us. And yesterday and even today, you might have heard a little bit of wind gusts. Apologies if that messes with the audio, but we were getting 20, 30, 40 mile an hour gusts here and there. And then the seas were projected over 14 feet yesterday. They're projected at 12 feet today. So we're keeping the kayaks in the storage unit right now. We're not going to go brave that. But we even got rain bands, and we're 200-300 miles away. And this storm is so massive and so powerful. And this is common, even if they don't get to Category 5, the amount of rain and the impact of these storms. And you see this in Florida, I'm sure, you might not get a direct hit, but, you can get flooded. Even just a tropical storm can shut down the airports and flood streets these days. And it's really it's the rain that can be real devastating. So luckily, we didn't get really impacted in any significant way at all. But we obviously are still feeling it. The skies are pretty gray today. It's still gusting probably 20 to 30 today. It'll probably keep gusting that until tomorrow. Then we'll go back down to our normal 10 to 20 mile an hour winds. But yeah, it's something, especially if you're going to be traveling to the Caribbean in the summertime. Usually I would have said August, September, but now I guess we have to say June through September, maybe even into October. You want to obviously keep an eye out, make sure that there's no storms coming, to make sure that you're safe, and that you don't get caught up in a situation down here. So it's something that unfortunately we're dealing with. The world's a little crazy when it comes to the climate and weather patterns and some of the strong storms that we're seeing. So, it's something that we got to keep our eye on here, but we got lucky this time. And unfortunately some of the other islands didn't. And that's kind of how it goes. Some years you get lucky, some years you're the unlucky one.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that you're safe, and certainly prayers and thoughts for the people that are in that storm's path previously and in the future here.
Still,
it's a serious storm. All right. So to change it up a little bit, Carter Smith-Wellman, we've got you on the hot seat, and these are just quick questions that we go through to get to know you a little bit better. And it's designed to actually give us something to talk about in the beginning. This is the first time we've ever done it at the end, because you're a natural, dude. You should have your own podcast. So here we go. Text or call?
Text.
Chocolate or vanilla?
Chocolate.
Inshore or offshore?
That's an easy one. Inshore every day.
Fly or drive or boat, I guess.
Sorry, say that again?
Fly, drive, or boat?
Oh.
In your situation. Yes, fly.
I'm going to go fly.
Favorite athlete of all time?
Tiger Woods.
Oh, I thought you were going to say Ted Williams. Destination you'd like to visit for fishing?
The Yucatan.
U.S. Virgin Islands or British Virgin Islands?
Oh, come on, U.S.
It's a softball. A movie that makes you laugh. Yeah.
Step Brothers.
What is your most productive time of the day?
right now.
Which is morning. Yep.
Yeah, I'd say 10 a.m.
One thing that you've changed your mind on in the last few years.
How quickly nature can really recover if you let it.
Good.
Don't be as pessimistic as some of the people out there are.
Best piece of advice you remember being given?
If you don't dream big enough and you're not a little bit scared, you're not dreaming big enough. I would say that's it.
I love it. Who told you that?
It was in a song.
Okay, that counts.
From my childhood.
What's your standard order at a coffee shop?
I gotta go cold brew, cream, 1 pump of caramel, not 2 or 3, 1.
Okay. An underground or unknown place on your island that tourists would never find, but they would enjoy.
Shell Island, offshore K.
Okay, tell me about it.
That's where I catch my bonefish. It's incredible. So when they dredged all the industrial stuff and they cut through the corals and they cut through the sand, the one good thing they did is they dumped it all on this little island, and they built up this island. And it's probably one of the most incredible islands I've ever seen. On one side, you've got hundreds of permit tailing every day in the corals, because when they dredged it up, it's half coral, half sand. So they put all the corals on the back edge facing the deep water, and you've got these coral flats and these huge drop-offs. And these permit will live in those drop-offs, come up on the coral flat. You have hundreds of jacks. We caught 15-pound horse eyes in the middle of the day. Yeah. And then you walk across the island 5-10 minutes, and you're at my favorite bonefish spot where, as I said, if I see those pits happening there, 1,000% that's bonefish, and I know it, and you're going to get on a bone. So like 2 days ago, we went, caught a 15-pound permit on one side, came back, caught a 5.5-6 pound bonefish on the other. I don't know many places that you can do that.
Sounds awesome. That's definitely
Sight
a place.
too.
Definitely a place that I want to go. Favorite cheat meal?
Ooh, lasagna.
Lasagna.
Yeah.
And then, in your opinion, what is your best catch or your catch of a lifetime?
I gotta say it's the 8-pound bonefish on the Rapala. I still got her. She's retired. She's pretty beat up. She's lost her bill. Yeah, this is a new one. This is one that's, you can see the color difference, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So this thing's caught probably every single fish out here, at least 20 species, but it's got to be the first big bonefish on the Rapala for me. That's a memory I will never forget.
I love it. Well, Carter, this has been fantastic, man. You're really, really great at this, and you gave us so much interesting information about where you're living in Saint Croix and the history, and then the bonefish conversation was fantastic. So I'll make sure that Mike Larkin hears this when it comes out, and I'm going to see you soon, man. I don't know when, but I'm going to come.
Yeah,
I really am. I'm
definitely.
going to come. I mean, you did a great job. It was a place that was on my radar anyway, just because I think it would be a great place to bring my wife. But now that you have,
island.
I've seen the pictures and everything, but now that you have outlined the fishing, I may come for a week, and then she can come meet me for a second week. I don't know.
That sounds good.
Yeah,
that sounds good. Just let me know. We'll get that calendar cleared, and we'll get you on. We'll get you on those slams.
All right.
See if we can't get that 10-pounder. Let's see if we can't find that 10-pounder. We've seen a few running around, but she's still eluded us so far. But they're out there.
Okay, it sounds awesome. I'm definitely going to have to try to catch one of your permit too, because that's ultimately that's my favorite. But anyway, all right, Carter, thanks so much for joining us. And if you are interested in following him, definitely go to his Instagram and his YouTube. And I think I'm going to check out your YouTube. I already have you on Instagram, but the YouTube, definitely going to check that out. All right, thanks. We'll be back next week with another guest like Carter and help you to get better at fishing. All right, that's it. See ya.